This is a presentation about the residential school experience. Pictured here are some resources if you are feeling triggered during the presentation. Please make note of them. They will be available throughout the presentation and also at the end. So Four Directions is located on Treaty Fort territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. My name is Lisa Workman, and I'm the Aboriginal Community Development Coordinator at Four Directions Community Health Center. I am a First Nations woman from Regina. My affiliation is Sakamay First Nations. This presentation is part of the work of the Four Directions Reconciliation Committee, which is guided by the Saskatchewan Health Authority Commitment to Truth and Reconciliation Statement and by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's work, including the calls to action. So to begin the residential school experience presentation, I would like to start with some of the history that led up to the creation of residential schools. I feel that this prehistory shows the stark changes to our people. In the beginning, before European contact, First Nations people lived a traditional life. We lived off of the land. Everyone was cared for and had a place in the community. Our people were healthy and fit. The foods that were eaten were low fat and full of nutrients, all natural. Everyone was active, working to make sure everyone had enough to eat. Physical activity was practiced in competitions and games. Strong, fit people were admired. People took care of themselves, including all four of their healths: mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. People could live a very long time. They knew what they needed to be healthy. First Nations people had a strong spirituality. This gives a feeling of security of who you are and your place in the world. It also gives you a feeling of certainty about what life and death is about. You are much less fearful and less confused. Part of the spirituality included a very specific set of values. That makes life's decisions much easier. First Nations peoples appreciated life and all of its gifts. This gives a person a feeling of happiness and well-being. You have a positive attitude and you feel thankful for what you have. You respect the resources you have and you don't abuse them. You know that you aren't the center of the universe. Elders were respected for their knowledge and experience. They were the keepers of knowledge, passing it down from one generation to the next. Our traditional life was interrupted by European visitors. They started arriving around 1500. Along with them, they brought a number of diseases such as smallpox, measles, influenza, and tuberculosis. The First Nations people had little immunity and had no medicine or previous knowledge to deal with such diseases. Many First Nations died of disease. Many were also killed as the Europeans took over lands. By the 1700s, First Nations people were under strict rule. Over the next 100 years, much of the land was taken through legislation and treaties. In 1876, the Canadian government first introduced the Indian Act, which was mostly about assimilating and restricting the First Nations and their rights. Although there has been many changes to the Indian Act over the years, it has had a huge impact on the First Nations. So pictured is a link where I got this information from. I believe there is a book called 21 Things You May Not Have Known About the Indian Act. But here are some of the restrictions and impacts imposed on First Nations. The Indian Act denied women status, introduced residential schools, created reserves, renamed individuals with European names, restricted First Nations from leaving reserves without permission from an Indian agent, enforced enfranchisement or the loss of status rights of any First Nations person admitted to university, would expropriate portions of reserves for roads, railways, and other public works, could lease out uncultivated reserve lands to non-First Nations if the new leaseholder would use it for farming or pasture, It forbade First Nations people from forming political organizations, prohibited anyone, First Nations or non-First Nations, from soliciting funds for First Nations legal claims without special license, prohibited the sale of alcohol to First Nations, prohibited the sale of ammunition to First Nations, prohibited pool hall owners from allowing First Nations entrance. It imposed the band council system. It forbid First Nations from speaking their native language, forbid First Nations from practicing their traditional religion. It forbid Western First Nations from appearing in any public dance, show, exhibition, stampede, or pageant wearing traditional regalia. Declared potlatch and other cultural ceremonies illegal. Denied First Nations the right to vote. Created a permit system to control First Nations' ability to sell products from their farms. And it is a piece of legislation under the British rule for the purpose of conquering one race, the Aboriginal people. The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change, says John A. Macdonald in 1887. The first Prime Minister of Canada is said to be responsible for much of the efforts to assimilate First Nations people. Some even believe he attempted to wipe out the First Nations people. It is a controversial point whether this part of Canadian history, along with the residential school experience, is considered genocide. Residential schools were places where First Nations children were taken from their communities to live. The whole point of residential schools was to make First Nations children just like other Canadians. The children were basically told everything they knew was wrong. Their long hair was cut, they weren't allowed to speak their native language, practice their spirituality, or any of their culture. They had to speak English or French, even if they never learned it before. They had to practice a new harsh religion. Besides being pulled away from their parents and home communities, often siblings were separated at school. Conditions at these schools were not very good. The food was plain and not very nutritious, and there wasn't much of it. They didn't have proper clothing, especially for cold winters. There wasn't much help for medical issues. The teachers and staff were often very strict. Students had school in the morning but worked all afternoon. Many of the schools were very strict, and this often led to severe punishments and even physical abuse. It is important to note that not all residential school survivors had bad experiences. Some say they had no issues and came out with an education and work skills. But unfortunately, there were a lot of issues for many of the survivors. There was physical abuse, harsh punishments, along with physical abuse. There was threats, mental and emotional abuse. There was also sexual abuse and sexual assaults at the hand of teachers, priests, and even older students. Abuse was often handed down into families, continued by survivors of the abuse in residential schools. Spiritual abuse was forcing the students to abandon their own spirituality and severely imposing Christianity. This spiritual abuse has had a deep impact in communities, families, and individuals. There is a deep divide between those who continue to practice Christianity and those who practice traditional First Nation spirituality. Some survivors refuse to practice either, and only a few actually practice both. Here is the supports again. So I'd like to recommend a website, and please be advised that these videos may have some triggering effects. Be sure to reach out to one of the counseling resources that I had listed. But do check out the website. There are a number of stories from all over Canada, but there are some specifically from Saskatchewan. So, some of the aspects of residential schools. The children were removed from home, separated from families and even siblings at school. Culture and spirituality were banned. They were forced to practice a foreign and harsh religion. Little food, not nutritious or good tasting. Studies in a language they weren't familiar with. Physical abuse and harsh punishments. Sexual abuse, assaults. Unhealthy, sick often, and not medically treated. Worked half-time. Overcrowded, poor sanitation, threats, mental and emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, and a high death toll. This picture is a picture of Riley Burns. He is in that website. He's one of the stories, and he's from Gordon First Nations. So I would recommend his story. So the direct effects on residential school survivors. No connection or pride to own culture, traditional culture. Lack of confidence and identity. No experience being part of a family. Unable to express themselves, express love. Unable to parent because they weren't parented. Addictions, they used addictions to cope. They developed mental health issues, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. They experienced low levels of education, which led to unemployment, poverty. They experienced self-destruction, they continued cycles of abuse, and many experienced suicide and early death. The lasting impacts, or the intergenerational effects, or the community effects. Much of our people are disempowered. There is a loss of traditional knowledge, spirituality, and culture. Cycles of abuse continue. Mental health issues continue. Addictions and FASD. There is involvement in the sex trade and trouble with other trouble with the law and incarceration. There are children in care, lateral violence, gang activity, violence, communities and families divided by religion versus traditional spirituality. There's a dependence on the welfare system, facing racism, there's poverty, transiency, and homelessness. Abuses and trauma, pictured is Lorna Standing Ready. She's an advocate for residential school survivors. Abuses and trauma that occurred in residential schools had an enormous impact on the survivors. Some would continue some of the abusive behavior they learned when they had families of their own. Some would turn to alcohol or other addictions to cope with the trauma that they incurred. Some suffered from depression and other mental health issues. Some became self-destructive and suicidal. Some have died due to these problems. As you can imagine, there was a high death toll at residential schools due to illness, severe abuse, and students attempting to run away. Those who survived the residential schools suffer from many ill effects. Survivors found it hard to adjust when they arrived back in their home communities. They were used to the institutional life. First of all, they had no connection or pride in their own culture. This gave them a lack of confidence and a lack of identity. Survivors lacked the experience of being part of a family and being parented. This made it hard for them to express love and to properly parent. Many survivors came out with mental health issues such as post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety. Some survivors turned to alcohol and other addictions to cope, and others became self-destructive and suicidal. Many survivors lived in poverty because of the many problems that they faced. They just couldn't hold down a job. Many survivors have become dependent on the welfare system. Some survivors became involved with the justice system. Some suffered an early death due to these issues. Some survivors are still struggling with issues. Still, some survivors were able to find a healing path and overcome some of these issues. Some are still healing. I strongly believe that the residential experience started many cycles that continue to this day. In our communities, we see violence, addictions, crime, gang activity, and even diabetes and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and suicide. There's poverty and a reliance on the welfare system. Unfortunately, we see many of our children in the foster system. All of these issues started with the strict and hopeless life of the residential schools. Cycles of violence and abuse started with the physical and sexual abuse in residential schools. Survivors continued the cycle with their families, and it continued to be passed down in families. Violence and abuse has led to crimes like prostitution, gang activity, assault, and murder. Today, we see way too many of our people in the justice system. There are descendants of survivors who never went to residential schools who are affected by these cycles. I hope that youth today can understand the history and these cycles. In my experience, learning about the residential schools really changed my life. Suddenly, I understood what was happening in my community and in my own life. I have had suffered in my past. I've suffered with present depression and alcoholism, even though I didn't go to residential school. But my mom and my grandmom went to residential school. These cycles are deeply rooted in our communities, and we can't just get over it. It's ingrained in our being. I believe that in the future we will see big positive change. We will see cycles broken and great healing. The residential school experience is not over. As I mentioned, there are a number of issues that we see in our communities, but there are also current events that are tied to the residential school experience, such as Wednesday, June 11th, 2008, the Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, made a statement of apology to former students of Indian residential schools on behalf of the Government of Canada. December 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report, including 94 calls to action, which we are still working through. May 2021, 215 unmarked graves are discovered at the site of Kamloops Indian Residential School. June 2021, approximately 750 unmarked graves are discovered near the former Maryvale Indian Residential School near Cowessess First Nations. September 30th, 2021, Canada marks its first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau takes a private day with his family instead of taking part in the many events that happened across the country. July 25th, 2022, Pope Francis issues an apology. January 12th, 2023, a jawbone of a child approximately 5 years old was found at Star Blanket First Nations around their old residential school site. It is estimated to be about 100 years old. And also in January 2023, those who attended Indian Day School are filing extensions for claims for compensation. There are also current events that are tied to the intergenerational effects of the residential school experience, such as missing and murdered Indigenous persons, the 60s scoop compensations, and Indigenous homelessness, such as Camp Hope last year. So now you know all about the residential school experience. What can be done about it? If you are Indigenous, you can do what you can to address trauma, grief, and break cycles. If you are non-Indigenous, you can be an ally. Here are some tips. Know about the traditional keepers of this land. Four Directions is located on Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Learn about some of the local history. For example, Regina used to be referred to as Oscana by the Cree people. Oh, sorry, there's more than that. Oscana Kaasasteki by the Cree people, and I apologize, I'm pronouncing it wrong. Anyways, it means where the bones are piled, and referred to the large amount of buffalo bones on the banks of the Wascana Creek. This is evidence of the killing off of the buffalo as a way of driving out the First Nations and Métis people. Learn more about the residential schools, the impacts, the intergenerational effects, current events, and traditional First Nations culture. And I highly recommend taking part in the Kairos blanket exercise. Talk about truth and reconciliation, and remember to focus on the First Nations and Métis and their story. The advice is not to make it about yourself. Speak up, speak out, and report incidents of racism. Encourage others to do the same. In the health region, incidents of racism can be reported to the patient advocate. Celebrate First Nations culture. Get involved with the Indigenous community through community events, cultural gatherings, and learning opportunities. Most First Nations events are open, such as powwows and round dances, and you can also go to sweats and things like that. Just talk to an elder and find out what you can be involved with. Support Indigenous authors, artists, creators, business owners, and professionals. In our work, I think it is important to consider some of these things as well. Don't make assumptions. Not all Indigenous people attended residential school or had a bad experience at residential school. but many have. Not all Indigenous people are affected by trauma or addiction in their lives, but again, many have. Better to treat everyone with trauma-informed care. Be willing to work with people where they at. If they are active in their addiction, they still need care. If they are crisis-driven, try and be flexible and tolerant. Don't assume that an Indigenous person is in touch with their traditional culture or spirituality. Many people in our community are reaching out for it. Be ready to offer some resources for learning and connecting with culture more. Some good places to start are Niwo Yotina Friendship Center, The Gathering Place, or Regina Treaty Status Indian Services, Circle Project, Prairie Spirit Connections, and the SHA also has elders. These are good resources to start with in the community. Believe in your potential to facilitate the breaking of cycles. We have seen it at 4 Directions. The right person in the right place at the right time can do wonders. Build trust and be consistent. Don't expect this population to respond easily at first. Much of the population has been let down many times before. In conclusion, reconciliation is not about pointing fingers or laying blame. It is not about getting over it. It is about setting right what went wrong in Canadian society and its systems. It's about decolonization and cultural rebirth. It is about all Canadians. It's not us and them. It is all of us. Again, please reach out to these resources if you feel like you were triggered during this presentation. And thank you for your time. And that's what I have for you. Thanks.